Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Sometimes saying nothing can be the best play that you make. You can't get in trouble for the things that you don't say. Someone perhaps should pass that on to Eddie and Barry Hearn in particular, because they've said some stuff that does make it appear that they don't want to make a fight between their superstar Anthony Joshua and fellow champion Deontay Wilder. And before I launch into things, I'll just say perception is important. It's very important. There's the old saying, perception is reality. And often perception, it can very easily override and overtake the facts, and it can change minds very quickly. Just keep that in mind, because some of the things that have been said arguably have shifted the narrative in this whole Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua saga. Or at least it's got some people questioning it. I'll start with Barry Hearn, because the bulk of the what I would call at least surprising comments and revealing and insightful comments have come from him. And he was interviewed by IFL TV by Coogan Cassius while at a charity fishing day. But it does seem that the only thing that he's landed is himself in hot water with free and frank admissions. So in respect of a Wilder and Joshua fight, he stated that he had advised to leave it for 2 years. He cited how Mayweather and Pacquiao held off, and that made their fight much bigger. He says right now it's a $70 to $80 million fight, but in 2 years' time it might be worth $250 or $300 million. He actually said that Shirley Finkel wanted to cash in Deontay Wilder straight away, and wanting the fight straight away is crazy. That Shelley knows better than that, unless he didn't fancy winning the fight and thought we'd better get some money out of him now. He says he also told Anthony Joshua that the fight will only get bigger, and that if he was to retire in 6 months' time, take the fight now, but if he was to fight for a longer period of time, then he could afford to let it grow. And that 2 years is the maximum period that he'd want to hold off before having the fight. But he said his ideal was fall 2019. And Barry said the worst case scenario is Anthony Joshua doesn't fight Deontay Wilder and he ends up unbeaten after 10 years. And Hearn, he said he would take that. I have to say, while you can commend Barry Hearn for his honesty, he hasn't covered himself with glory here with his comments. Some of it was in fact quite damning, especially the part where he says Shelley Finkel wants the fight now and Finkel's crazy for wanting that. I'm not sure he actually considered, this is Barry Hearn, that those comments strengthen the Wilder camp's argument that they wanted the fight more than the Joshua camp, because he's saying Shelley Finkel's crazy for wanting it now. It says a lot. From what Barry Hearn is saying, he wants to milk it for all it's worth, build it into a fight 2, 3, or 4 times the size of what it is now, and he advised Joshua of this. And he's saying all of this to us fans now, the strategy, explaining it. And what that actually allows us to do is to look back at some of the recent failed negotiations, the goings-on, with fresh information, fresh eyes, a fresh perspective. And we're all able to draw our own conclusions from the result of what actually occurred in light of this evidence that and this insight that Barry Hearn has provided us. And he may not have meant it to come out or come across the way that it has, but it did. So money first, fans second, build the fight, make it bigger. That's essentially what he was saying. I would also note, as an aside, that Barry Hearn, he also stated in the interview that giving up home advantage isn't something you should ever do. So if you consider that in the context of his other comments, then arguably it certainly weakens the whole I want to fight in the UK for my fans line that Anthony Joshua started to run after he backed away from an offer of $50 million from Deontay Wilder. A lot of what Barry Hearn has said, it actually runs counter to the carefully positioned arguments that Eddie Hearn has been running for months. And they would have been talking about and really strategizing on how they were going to position their lines, what they were saying. And in the space of a few minutes, Barry Hearn has managed to severely undermine many of the arguments that Eddie Hearn has been feeding to the public on a regular basis. I'm sure some people might say all of this stuff doesn't matter and that they'll be fighting eventually anyway. But if perceptions shift on who did what and when, who really wanted this fight, then it could potentially impact how some people at least feel about Anthony Joshua. It could affect his brand. It could have some sort of impact on it. And arguably the mess that was the negotiations, it hurt everyone involved because the negotiations were protracted, they were bitter, and very much public. And now we hear from Eddie Hearn Sr. that actually, he always advised to push things out for as long as possible because we can all make this bigger, guys. So it does strengthen the narrative and the argument that what happened 3 or 4 months ago was in part for show. Okay, so getting to Eddie Hearn. He's mentioned that they'll need to confirm Anthony Joshua's next opponent within a month or so of the Alexander Povetkin fight. That is, of course, if he wins. So roughly, if he does win, they'd need to confirm an opponent for April in mid-October, 6 months before that fight. It's quite a big gap, isn't it? And the reason that's been given is the sanctioning bodies and their mandatory defences, they'll soon be due. This is the WBO and IBF, and they need to file exceptions well in advance of that scenario. They need to get in early. And as a result of all that, and I did mention this in a previous video, that's why I believe Dillian Whyte is in the running to be that next opponent for April. And that tight time frame, because it's only 6 weeks away or so, it doesn't really give Deontay Wilder and his team any wriggle room to, draw out negotiations if they were to even enter them. And in the shadow of the Barry Hearn comments, which could very well be the lens that a lot of us and a lot of these issues are now viewed, is it reasonable to expect Wilder to agree to a condensed time frame when there's so much distance to close between the two camps? Because they didn't part on very good grounds a couple of months ago. And they aren't even speaking right now. That's an admission that Hearn made. So based on what Hearn Sr. is saying, he at least doesn't have an appetite to make the Wilder fight. And if they're not talking now, it doesn't really feel likely that it's going to get made. And while Eddie Hearn, he definitely laid out the situation and explained what needed to occur by when and why for a Wilder fight to happen. Is this target, is it just unachievable? Is the goalpost just too far away? They just can't reach it. And we also have to consider that it probably was in Deontay Wilder's and his team's interest to get through the Tyson Fury fight first before entering negotiations again. Because a win there against Fury, it increases his commercial value and thus his negotiating power. Now, I'm sure there's going to be quite a number of people who don't like to hear me taking a critical look at these statements of Barry Hearn and Eddie Hearn, and Barry Hearn in particular, and they won't like what I'm saying. I'm sure that there's been a number of comments dropped how I'm starting to fanboy for Deontay Wilder. And that's not the case, and it's not a case that I'm anti-Anthony Joshua. It isn't about supporting one fighter over another. It's about looking at the statements that have been made, breaking them down, analysing them, and giving my take on them. And I feel the ball has been dropped here in a big way. A damaging way. I'm sure Team Wilder is actually looking at some of what's been said, and they'll be encouraging Eddie and Barry Hearn just to keep talking, keep saying stuff. Say something else that can be perceived as not wanting the Wilder fight, because they've been doing a good job of it. Right now, it is coming down to perception. And I don't need to read massive missives in the comment section. Please don't leave them. I know what happened, who did what, and when. I lived it and breathed it for 3 months. And the reality is, what I saw and heard was both sides were ramming down their own version of events for 3 months straight for their own purposes. But now so much water is under the bridge, so much detail on the back and forth is out there. It is really hard to keep up with the timeline of who did what and when and how, keep it straight in our own minds. That's why I'm coming back to perception. You, like me, probably felt a certain way after it all fell to pieces. You probably weighed the pros and cons of each side, their arguments, and determined who you believed was at fault or otherwise, and who did and didn't want the fight. But now that we've had these comments, these howlers from Barry Hearn, I'm sure it's going to lead to a bit of a shift in perception. The narrative might not be quite sort of locked down in stone. And it doesn't necessarily mean the facts have changed. But with this extra information, it at least gives us another data point to consider, to look at with fresh eyes, and it will perhaps change some people's minds. But it's probably advisable, given what's gone on. Eddie Hearn and Barry Hearn try to stick a pin on commenting on all this stuff so often in public, because the more that they're talking, the more that they're revealing over time, they're actually starting to put themselves in it, because their stories aren't consistent, and they're actually making Anthony Joshua look bad by default through some of their own actions. Loose lips sink ships. So they could have really avoided some of this by actually trying to move on, trying not to keep talking about it. They could have had some standard answers to run with. They could have actually got through this without putting themselves in it. I don't think they've covered themselves in glory, and they've actually opened the wound up for people to have a look at again with some fresh information, and it may change some people's minds. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.